Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Richard Bell, the author of The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. He has written 4 books and is a professor of history at the University of Maryland. Dr. Bell, thanks so much for being here. This is your second appearance on the show. We last saw you in January of 2021 for our 33rd episode of this show, and this is going to be somewhere in the episode 190s, somewhere in there. So it's great to have you back after so long.
Thanks, Evan. Does that make me a founding parent, a founding father?
Yeah, I've probably had maybe 12 or 15 people on once or twice, but yeah, in the 30s, that's young, as they say. The show was still young, but I've welcomed people back who were on the first episode of the show. She's been on 3, 4, 5 times, so I guess you got to pump some more books out, and we'll have you back in.
I'll keep working. I'll keep working on it.
Yeah, there you go. Before we start, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. From where we sit in 2025, almost everybody alive has only known America to be a superpower. As world events go, America often plays a major role. There's just no doubt. The economy, the military, foreign policy, foreign outreach, America's science, athletics. There's almost no escaping American influence. But Dr. Bell argues that this phenomenon first happened in the 1770s. He writes, in its very gestation, the revolution was a global event that drew participants from all over the world. It shook every quarter of the globe, setting much of the world in motion. So, Doctor, did you always view it this way, or is this something that you stumbled upon while doing research? How did this theory build?
You know, some of the best history books are written by stumbling around till you find something interesting, right, that startles you. And that was true for my last book, Stolen, and it's true for this book too, because as some of your listeners will notice right away, I'm perhaps not from the original 13 colonies. I was born just outside London. This is what's left of a British accent after 25 years living in America. And I'm now a very proud naturalized US citizen who votes early and votes often. And since I've lived in the US, it's been apparent to me that when I was a, K-12 student back in England, I never learned anything about the American Revolution, let alone its global significance and geopolitical ripple effects. It wasn't until I came to college in the US that I began to learn about that situation. But I would say even here, Evan, the way we often talk about the American Revolution in public is not in global terms, right? It's as a narrow domestic drama, rebels versus redcoats and no one else, hugely significant for the birth of the United States, but not hugely significant in world history in the 18th century. I'm here to tell you that's wrong. I'm here to tell you that the American Revolution was a geopolitical earthquake, a convulsion that shook the world as it was happening in the 1770s and 1780s, pulling all sorts of people into that war, as you pointed out, and also having global ripple effects.
Before we go any further, I just want to mention AxelbankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, featured episodes, excuse me, and also a link to that Patreon page I mentioned. So everyone check out Nikki's work. I'm wondering about the way the American Revolution is taught in England, or I guess not taught. Do you think that's a result of, no offense, of being like a sore loser kind of thing? Or are there historians just kind of not feel as though it fits into what kids in England in the 2020s need to know?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, and certainly no offense taken there, right? I don't think most British people go around nursing grievances about losing a war that happened 250 years ago. In fact, you know what, Evan? When I came to the US for graduate school, and Americans I met learned that I was studying American history, they would say, aren't you upset you lost the war? And the first time an American asked me that, I had no idea what war they were talking about, right? I was thinking back to like World War II, no, World War One, no. Turns out they were talking about the American Revolution. I would say most British people don't nurse those sort of grievances because they don't know anything about the American Revolution or why it mattered because they never studied it in school. As to why why we never studied it in school, why I never studied it in school, I think it's probably some of the same familiar dynamics you see in every nation, right? Every nation often tells its school children fairly comforting, fairly nation boosting sort of narratives about its own history and role in the world. So, what I did study in British K-12 all those years ago, I'm 47 right now, was the Tudors, that's Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, defeating Catholic France, defeating Catholic Spain, defeating the Catholic Pope. Do you see a pattern there,
Mhm.
Evan?
Yeah.
And then we jumped forward right to World War II when Britain defeats the Nazis single-handedly, Evan, without any help from any other countries. Did you know that? So that's what I was told by my gym teacher slash history teacher. So I wrote it down. It turns out, guess what? There's a lot more to all those stories, and there's a lot more to global history in the period between the Tudors and the Second World War than I was ever led to believe when I was a kid.
The interesting thing is when you talk to people young and old here in the United States, people say, "Gosh, weren't the founders amazing? Weren't they just amazing?" I mean, and that was maybe it's less true today because America's kind of undergone a cultural shift since the mid 2010s. But previous to that, when I was growing up, it was this, they were sort of these amazing, sort of godlike figures that understood the way a country should operate. And gosh darn it, they just made it so. What do you think it is about the way the American founding happened that lent itself to this creation of automatic pride?
Yeah, so it's great to have national pride. I think I'm certainly in favor of having national pride. I'm proud of both countries I'm associated with. I'm proud of Britain. I'm proud of the US as a naturalized US citizen. That doesn't mean we can't be sort of critical and reflective about these histories. The American Revolution is a curious beast because on the one hand, it's a war, and I know we'll talk about the war's global dimensions in a second. But on the other hand, as you said in your question, Evan, it's also America's founding story. It's America's origin story. It gives birth to the United States. And because it's a birth story, an origin story, a creation story, it has particular stakes attached to it, right? We want to be proud of our moment of birth, our moment of origin, and that makes it very difficult to see the actual war that produced that republic in 360 terms, in complicated, reflective terms. So I think that's what we're up against, right? To peel back some layers of myth, often sort of nationalist myth, and recognize that this wasn't just a birth story, it was also a major story in the creation of the modern world as well.
You write that from almost the moment the revolution was over, historians seemed to ignore the revolution's global impacts. In those early days, without the technology that is now second nature to us today, we can literally see a war happening in real time or click into someone's live feed on Facebook or Twitter or something from Iraq and know what's going on there right now, where we can see things literally happening in real time around the world. What information was coming in from around the world in the 1770s, and how is that information getting here?
So you're right. The information environment is very different, right? There aren't telegraph cables, which will be the big sort of global technology of the 19th century. There's certainly no internet or satellite imagery. So what we have is messages and ships. And what we can say is, despite the sort of fairly primitive nature of global communications, right? People carrying messages written on pieces of paper that travel on ships across oceans, the system is remarkably far-reaching and robust. If you opened Evan, a newspaper in, let's say, Charleston, South Carolina, in 1774. It would have some news from Charleston, of course, but most of its news would be news from much further afield. There would be news from other American colonies like Boston and Philly and New York, but there'd also be tons of news from London and then tons of news via London from Dublin, France, Spain, India, and even parts of the Spanish empire. So there are global news hubs like London and Paris and Boston, and from those sort of hubs spread out spokes of communication networks, all of them supported by, men on horses, by newspaper editors copying each other's news stories called the newspaper exchange system, and by sailing ships. And of course, even if this system is amazing and far-reaching and robust, it's also prone to being undermined from time to time by the weather, by the tides, by animals getting sick, by ships getting intercepted or sinking. There's a famous example of this I want to share with you. And this actually is not weather related, but it reminds you of the delicacy of these networks. When the Patriot Continental Congress printed the Declaration of Independence on July 5th, it printed 200 copies and started sending them out, many of them to Europe. And it wanted to send some to France, of course, right, to get King Louis involved in the war. And so it put a couple on a ship bound for Bordeaux, and that ship did not sink. But that ship was intercepted by a British ship. And as soon as the captain of the American ship saw the British ship coming, he thought, uh-oh, I don't want them to find these declarations of independence on board. And he tossed them over the side. And they went to the bottom of the ocean, probably, to be eaten by the fishes. So those sorts of fragilities and vulnerabilities are definitely built into this information network. But the simple truth is, Evan, you could open a newspaper in Charleston and there'd be information from India in it. And that's remarkable in the 18th century.
It really is. And as the revolution started and as this war started and the Declaration of Independence, was distributed, were colonists reading the reaction? I guess, in other words, the question is, were there columnists, what we would call columnists today, were there columnists in other countries writing about this, and were the colonists reading their reactions?
So, yes, I don't think the word columnist has yet entered the lexicon, sadly, by the 18th century, but there are people who regularly write essays for the newspapers responding to current events. So they're columnists in all but name. So I'm thinking, for instance, of a British guy in London whose name is Samuel Johnson. He's quite famous on the other side of the Atlantic because he wrote one of the most famous English dictionaries, Dr. Johnson's Dictionary in 1755. And when the American War breaks out, Dr. Johnson is a big supporter of the King's War to suppress the colonies. So every time, the Continental Congress does something or George Washington makes an advance, Samuel Johnson will write about it in the London papers and, try and belittle the achievements of the Patriots. We also know that in the French papers, for instance, they're covering the insurgency in British North America intensely. We know that in India, in British Madras, the Governor General of the East India Company there, Warren Hastings, is following developments in America via newspapers from London that are eventually making it out to him 5 months after the fact. So that's a remarkable sort of newspaper information system.
At the time, how did the colonists and those leading the colonists, the revolution, let's say Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, how did they understand this new nation's potential influence over the world?
So I think they shared the uncertainties that we should all think about when we think about the American Revolution. They couldn't see the future. They can't see that the new nation they're trying to build is going to one day be a global superpower, unlike anything else on the face of the planet. All they're trying to do is separate from a British Empire that they believe has become, decadent, corrupt, and out of touch with the people. So there's huge uncertainties about whether they're going to be able to achieve that war aim, Evan, of separating from the British Empire, because there is no precedent for that. You try naming another set of colonies that are separated from the British Empire before 1776, and you will fail. Try it for the French Empire, try it for the Spanish Empire, you will fail. There's no modern precedent in the 1770s for discontented colonists of any empire to break away. The previous example is from the 1500s with the Dutch in the Austrian Empire. So they are trying to beat the odds. The odds are against them. The British military's navy is the largest and strongest navy in the world. The British military is well funded and well financed. The Continental Army is an idea on the back of a napkin in 1775, right? With no money to support it, no resources, no soldiers, no artillery, no cavalry, no nothing. They have to build an army from scratch. And so one of the things that leaders of the Continental Congress and Continental Army figure out pretty early, Evan, and I'm thinking of George Washington and John Adams when I say this, is we're going to need help. We're going to need help from anyone willing to form any sort of commercial alliance or military alliance with us. And I would argue that we've forgotten that the cornerstone of Patriot strategy for victory is to bring in other powers, to
So,
bring in France and Spain and so on and so on.
yeah, so I was going to ask, what were these global entanglements? What were the early nations that America started to lean on, and how did they convince these nations to be a part of this ragtag situation that we had going on here?
Yeah, so Patriot strategy has a few different prongs to it. You know, one is to pull in talented individuals into the ranks of the Continental Army. And when we think about it, we know some of this story already, because who is the Marquis de Lafayette, if not a talented um, uh, uh, foreign military figure who comes and puts on an American uniform, a Continental Army uniform, and contributes to the war effort that way. He's actually the tip of the iceberg, Evan. We can find dozens of often unemployed, out of work European military officers who get a new gig in George Washington's army. Um,
Everyone's got to work, I guess, right?
Everyone's got to hustle, right? Hustle would be the word right now. And a great hustler I write about in the book, actually, is Baron Steuben, right? We call him Steuben sometimes, Baron Steuben, the out-of-work Prussian drill master who comes and shakes up the Continental Army, trying to Europeanize it, to make it capable of taking on a serious European military like the British Army. We could go down the list, you know, Casimir Pulaski, Vladimir Kosciuszko, Louis de Portet, etc., etc. So one part of this, Evan, is out-of-work European officers they can suck into the Continental Army, and Benjamin Franklin is sent to Europe in part to recruit these individuals into the army. And then on the macro scale, Franklin is also sent to Paris to coordinate sort of under-the-table, off-the-books, covert financing of the Patriot uprising, right? To sort of channel French and Spanish and Dutch loans and grants of weapons and cash and uniforms and medicine, and make sure they get to the battlefield so George Washington can use them. And then the third part of this, of course, is formal military alliances. And it takes a while to get formal military alliances achieved for reasons I'll talk about. But eventually, of course, France in 1778, Spain in 1779, eventually the Netherlands in 1780, and the Kingdom of Mysore over in India around the same time. Each of these foreign powers is not doing this because they're in love with the concept of all men being created equal and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. King Louis of France does not believe in any of that. King Louis is a king. He's a Catholic, not a Protestant. He has his own empire. He's doing it for his own internal reasons, as are the folks in Spain and Mysore and the Netherlands. But it's up to people like Franklin to persuade them that ultimately there's a common cause, and that common cause is cutting England down to size.
And I was going to ask, what are the internal reasons for these nations? What's the internal politics here going on inside these nations where they would say, you know, this seems like something that, even though, you know, we don't really necessarily care what happens to the Americans, but this can help what happens to us.
Yeah, let's pick maybe not France because it's the most familiar example. Let's pick Spain instead. We often forget just how important Spanish assistance was in the Revolutionary War. Some of us might remember that France is involved and there are French troops at Yorktown, but Spain we've largely forgotten, which is too bad because Spain is the most tenacious opponent Britain has in the war. Spain commits huge numbers of troops, soldiers, sailors, ships, and supplies to the war effort after 1779, though they're usually fighting outside of the 13 rebel colonies, which is why
Right.
we've forgotten them. They're fighting in Florida, your neck of the woods, Evan. They're fighting all along the Gulf of Mexico. They're fighting in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Belize. They're fighting, trying to invade Britain itself. They're fighting in Gibraltar off the coast of Spain and in the Caribbean and India and elsewhere. Why does Spain get involved? Because Catholic Spain and Protestant England have been fighting wars for most of the 18th century against each other. Spain was part of the Seven Years' War that was the previous global war, and Spain controls the largest land empire in the world at the time. The Spanish Empire is actually bigger than the British empire. Mexico City is like 10 times the size of Philadelphia, for instance, in the 1770s. And the Spanish Empire is starting to fray at the edges. It is underpopulated, and the British Empire is pushing up against it, taking Florida in the 1760s, if I'm remembering correctly, and pushing European British settlers out towards the Mississippi, which is the border with Spain. So Spain sees Britain as a global threat to its imperial possessions. Spain would like nothing more than the British Empire to be either dismantled or distracted or weakened in a way that helps shore up Spanish power in the New World. And closer to home, Evan, one more thing. Closer to home, Britain has occupied Gibraltar, a rocky outcrop on Spain's southern tip, since 1704. Spain hates that with a passion, and is desperate to get Britain out. And so as soon as it goes to war against Britain in the American Revolution, it persuades France to join with Spain and launch a joint attack on British Gibraltar. And that siege of British Gibraltar will turn out to be the longest, largest siege of the American Revolution.
If you were a normal person in these days, I'm talking, your tinkerer, I don't know, your locksmith, your iron worker, your shoemaker, and you lived a decently long life in those days. It was obviously shorter, but let's say you lived 60, 70, 80 years. Were you just used to this fighting? Did this fighting just, were you just surrounded by it? I mean, now, when one or two wars is happening, it feels traumatic because of how interconnected everything is, no matter who you are or where you live. But did people feel there was this constant upheaval happening, and how did that impact them?
I think they did actually, yes, and I'm sure they felt it just as traumatically as we do. War is hell, right? So I think the 18th century is an age of empires, but it's also an age of imperial war between Britain, France, and Spain. They're going at it most of the time in the 18th century. To be at peace is unusual in the 18th century. But what's also unusual are the strange bedfellows, Evan, that emerge in the Revolutionary War. Because remember, in the previous global war, the French and Indian War, American colonists, British colonists actually, had been fighting with the British Empire against against Catholic France and against Catholic Spain, right? The Americans had been fighting against the French Catholics and the Spanish Catholics. If we fast forward just 20 years, patriot leaders like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin are trying to pull Catholic France and Catholic Spain into the war on their side. Now imagine selling those new alliances to the American people.
Mm.
Imagine telling American colonists in 1778, guess what, guys? We've got new allies. It's our old enemies, Catholic France. The guys we've hated for the last 60 years, they're our new best friends. And there's a lot of deep-seated Francophobia, hatred of Frenchmen, and the equivalent for Spanish people lingering in the mindsets and the culture of the American people right up until the moment they form military alliances with them. So getting over Francophobia is one of the accomplishments of the American Revolution on the home front.
But I guess there always been freedom fries, I guess, right?
Oh my goodness.
What impact did and this might be a little bit of an aside, but I want to ask, what impact did the constant stream of migrants coming into the United States have on the global nature of this?
I love this question,
Yeah,
Evan. Yeah.
by
So
bringing themselves here, did migrants lead America to sort of always be looking outwardly?
I think there's a lot to that perspective, right? So it's incorrect to think of the American colonists on the eve of the Revolution as a cultural monolith. Some of them are British in origin, many of them are Irish in origin or Scots-Irish. There are also large numbers of, German migrants in places like Pennsylvania before the war. So America is already starting to become, in many places, a fairly diverse sort of melting pot sort of place. And so when we look in the ranks of the Continental Army, George Washington's army, there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of pluralism. There's a lot of polyglot language. I think the ranks of the Continental Army hum with a cacophony of different voices, different accents, different dialects, different languages, etc. The Irish are a great example. There's been a large wave of Presbyterian Irish migration, we call them the Scots-Irish, to the American colonies in the decades before the Revolution. Many of those Irish migrants have come because they're sick of being treated like second-class subjects of the British Empire. They have no great love for the Church of England or the Protestant leadership of the British Empire. So when the war comes, most of those Scots-Irish Presbyterians, they know whose side they're on. It's not King George's side, it's George Washington's side. So there are so many Irish Americans in the ranks of the Continental Army, Evan, that when they're fighting the British Army, British commanders are like, why are all our enemies sound like they're from Ireland? It's because, 20 years earlier they were from Ireland.
What about the hundreds of thousands of people who were abducted and brought here and their descendants? How did that impact the global reach of this?
Yeah, so there's two groups of people we might talk about in response to that question. There are, of course, people of African descent who've come to to the British colonies as enslaved people. They will seize the opportunity of this war within the British Empire to try to free themselves. And one way to think about the American Revolution is the moment when African descended people try to stage the largest exodus out of race slavery since biblical times. I tell that story in the book through the life of a guy called Harry Washington, who was enslaved by George Washington, escapes during the war, joins the British army in return for a flimsy promise of lifelong freedom, and then when Britain loses the war, forces the British army to relocate him first to Canada and eventually Sierra Leone, which is an amazing story, Evan. There should be a movie about Harry Washington. And then there's another group of abducted people who come to the colonies we don't often think much about, and that's convicts. Britain has a policy before the war of punishing its convicted felons by banishing them to 14-year terms of hard labor in its American colonies, especially Maryland and Virginia. And I live in Maryland, and it's
Yeah,
noticeably,
careful.
yeah, we've forgotten this story here in
Yeah,
Maryland. I'll tell you
that's
that. I'll tell you
fascinating. Yeah,
that.
right. Right.
So there's a massive convict trade to the American colonies before the war, which of course the war itself interrupts, right? And that means that Britain has large numbers of convicted felons overflowing in jails in Britain during the war, which it would love to send to Maryland, but can't because it's a war against Maryland. And so after the war, Evan, I tell the completely fascinating story of all the other places around the globe where Britain tries and fails to send its banished convicts. And the eighth of those places will be Australia, of course. So if you want a connection between the birth of Australia and the loss of the American colonies, then this book tells that story.
Wow. The last time I want to talk about how you built this a little bit here before we get back into it. The last time we had you on, we chatted about your book Stolen, which describes the story of five Black boys who were abducted from Philadelphia. They were trafficked to the South to become slaves, and then the effort to get them back. It was the reverse Underground Railroad, as you put it. How did your study of the 1820s, when that happened, help pave the way for you to write this book?
Thanks. I love that question, Evan. These books, in some ways, are quite different, right? That book was a very small story. This story couldn't be bigger in some ways. But one of the ways I've tried to make this big, sweeping, swirling story small is by focusing on individual lives whenever I possibly can. So I follow the story of the American Revolution for Black Americans through the life of Harry Washington. I follow the story of convict labor in the American Revolution through two convicts' lives, William Murray, a white man, and John Mosley, a black man. And I follow the lives of the story of indigenous Americans in this war through the life of Molly Brant, an Iroquois translator and go-between. In many of the chapters, I take one life and use it as a lens here. And that's a reminder, Evan, that these huge global wars are fought and felt on human scale. And also the way to put ourselves into the story, to empathize with these people, is not by, confronting readers with loads and loads of statistics and maps and battles, but by taking them into the lived experiences of a few ordinary people here and there. And many of these ordinary people go on these extraordinary journeys. I'll just tell you one quick story. There's a guy called John Mosley who I write about in the book. He is an enslaved man who escapes to the British Army during the war, like Harry Washington does. He ends up in London after the war, but is very badly treated, left destitute, and he commits a crime of economic necessity. He forges a form to claim a missing sailor's unclaimed wages. He argues it's a victimless crime. The British judge says no and sentences him to 14 years of hard labor in the new Botany Bay colony in Eastern Australia in 1788, and he'll be the first Black American to ever set foot in Australia. So he goes from slavery in America to hard labor in Australia as a direct result of the transforming geography of the American Revolution and the British Empire. But telling those big sweeping stories throughout those lives, I think, is the way to do it.
What sources did you seize on for this book? Did you, most people I interview look through sources from the United States, old newspapers, what have you. Were you able to go through and find sources from other countries to build this story about the global upheaval that the revolution created?
If all the legwork required to tell this story would be the work of, I think, 6 lifetimes, and also an unlimited research and travel budget, which, as someone who works for a state university, I do not have. So this book is a synthesis of decades of scholarship by experts in dozens of subfields who've done that digging in exactly those archives and then written articles about what they've found. I've pulled together, hundreds of pieces of research done by talented other scholars and tried to say, what does it all mean when we put this scholarship in the same conversation? So the story of John Mosley, for instance, first came to my attention through the work 25 years ago of an Australian historian named Cassandra Pybus, for instance. And so this was my COVID project, Evan. When COVID sent us all to our basements, I set up shop in my research library at on the campus here at Maryland and refused to leave, and basically read every book and article on the shelf about the 18th century, and then tried to figure out what new stories and new interpretations about America's very familiar founding fight I could draw out of all that scholarship. So imagine looking at all the books over my shoulder. I'm in my office today. There's hundreds of books behind me, and sitting down and reading all of them and saying, well, what do they add up to? That's sort of the project I set myself for this book.
That's a big project. Yeah, I was actually gazing at your bookcases. They're trying to make out if I had some of the same
I
titles
bet we have
here.
many of the same books.
I
Yeah.
bet we do. What is it like? Well, one of the things I talk with about historians on here, because so many of the people I interview are emotionally connected. They care about the stories that they're writing. They think it's really important. It makes them emotional. It is the culmination of years and years of their life's work. How important is it? So I guess the question is about the emotional distance
Yep.
that you have between yourself and the subject. Some authors have a hard time battling it. We talk about really important stories about racial history and civil rights, and these are emotional stories. Do you find that by writing about American history, you have a certain emotional distance, given that you're from another country, to begin with, or has that sort of dissolved as you have become more and more a part of America the longer you've been here?
What an interesting question. Yeah, I certainly felt for my last book, Stolen, I was hugely emotionally invested in the fate of those boys trying to free themselves from kidnapping and slavery. I also feel emotionally invested in this story as well, partly because, of course, the American Revolutionary War is this nation's founding story, as you and I talked about earlier in the conversation. And I'm not here to, overturn and wreck some of the, cherished understandings we have about the past, but I am here to complicate them. So I do that with a sort of sensitivity, with a hopefully a nuance and reverence that comes with being a US citizen. But I'm also an outsider, like you said, Evan, and I do think that means it's easier, perhaps, for me to see how myth sometimes gets in the way of truth telling about the American past. So I'm not particularly uncomfortable recognizing that George Washington was simultaneously the greatest president, the greatest leader this country's ever had, but also an enslaver who made life horrible for the dozens of enslaved people like Harry who were forced to work for him. So I think that outsider's perspective maybe is useful as I engage in expanding and complicating a story that many of us hold pretty close to our hearts.
Some of the people you mentioned early on in the book, the life sort of capsules that you've been able to find for people are really interesting. So I'll go through a couple of them. You said an out of work Russian drill master who's at a job interview in Pennsylvania, an Iroquois woman who fled to a refugee camp in Canada, a German man who cuts his own child's finger off so he doesn't have to go and fight in the war. Literally, his trigger finger was cut off. So what good is he going to be? The formerly enslaved American you mentioned, Harry Washington, is back in Africa fighting the British. A Chinese dock worker imitating the Boston Tea Party. These are really, really interesting capsules that you found. How did you find them, and what sort of led you to say this is all one story, not six or seven individual stories?
Yeah, well, let's pick the last one about the Chinese dock
I
workers
couldn't believe that. That is
there,
an
right?
amazing story.
Isn't it amazing? Yeah, I feel the
Amazing.
same way. So that story happens in 1839 in the Pearl River Delta, just outside Canton, so not a million miles from modern day New York, modern day Hong Kong. And on the face of it, Chinese dock workers throwing opioids into the river seems to have nothing to do with the American Revolution. It happens in 1839. Let me give you a bit more detail about that story. The Chinese dock workers are throwing British East India Company opium into the river, trying to destroy it. And that may ring a few bells to those of us who studied the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when American dock workers throw case after case, chest after chest of British East India Company cargo into the muddy, brackish waters of Boston Harbor. And they're trying to send a message about taxes, about tariffs, about monopoly power and corporate greed, and flooding a consumer market with an unwanted foreign good. And it's the exact same messages the Chinese government is trying to send against the penetration of British East India Company opium onto the Chinese consumer market in the 1830s. So, of course, the Chinese government explicitly and purposefully mimics the tactics of the Boston Tea Party protesters 60
And
years earlier.
how did you find that story? Where
So
was
that
that
story,
sitting?
yeah, so there's been great books about the history of the East India Company, which of course put the Boston Tea Party into historical perspective as not the only story we should know about the East India Company. The East India Company is a very sprawling and problematic global mega corporation with ties to the British Crown in the 18th century. Think of it like Amazon or Walmart today in sort of its global reach. And like any multinational today, it has its enemies, right? Some of whom are actually its rivals, some of whom are governments who resent its growing economic power. So any history of the East India Company, for instance, will often counterpoint that 1774 story with that 1839 story. But my point is that we don't often bring that 1839 ripple effect into our histories of the American Revolution. And when we do, we can see the ripple effects of the American Revolution as far afield as China. We can see the ripple effects as far afield in India, where all that opium is being grown by the East India Company after the war. So I think, keeping the Indian Ocean in context when we think about the American Revolution is a really sort of mind-altering way to think about the global dimensions.
We had a historian on here named Andrew Roberts who wrote
Oh,
an
sure.
amazing, you must know him, an
Yeah.
amazing book called The Last King of
It's right.
America.
You can't view.
Uh,
Listeners may not be able to see this. I'm pointing to it on my book of my bookshelves right behind me.
yeah,
It's right there.
yeah.
That
Oh,
big
there
red
it
book.
is. Yeah, the
Yeah,
red book. Yeah, there
yeah,
it is. Right, right, right.
yeah.
Amazing book. He's a really well-known and famous historian in Britain. So it was great to have him on. I'm wondering, how did Britain change after the war started? How was the king's power either threatened or enhanced or changed at home?
This is such an important question, Evan, because this is actually how I began this project. At the start of COVID, I was giving a lot of Zoom talks to different lifelong learning audiences across the country about pretty standard topics like, the Boston Massacre or something like that. And sometimes in questions at the end of those Zoom talks, someone might ask me, okay, that's fascinating, but what was the revolution like in Britain, right? What did British people think about it? Because they'd hear my British accent and expect me to know. And I
Right,
didn't know,
right.
Evan.
I
Back
haven't
in
been there. What do you think?
2020, I didn't know.
Yeah.
I didn't know. So I went to my research library, grabbed all the books about Britain in the 18th century, read them, and figured out what the answer was. And I'm grateful to Andrew Roberts, who wrote this terrific book called The Last King of America, to help plug in some of the pieces. What we know is that the British people were deeply divided about the American Revolution. We know that outside of Parliament and outside of the palace, the British people debated the American war all the time. And for every one of them who thought it was a great idea to try to stop the rebellion and force the colonists back into line, there were just as many other British people who thought that what the king was doing or what the prime minister was doing was national economic suicide. That why are we fighting our customers? Why are we fighting our clients, our suppliers? This is the most self-inflicted, pointless, stupid economic act we could ever take. And they sent petition after petition to Parliament, to the palace, begging them to end this war. There's a scholar named James Bradley who wrote a book, it's purple, it's somewhere on my shelves over there, all about these peace petitions that British people send to the Parliament, which are widely ignored, of course, by the King and the Parliament. So I call my chapter about the war in Britain, Evan, Disunited Kingdom, right? A reminder that what we think of as a united kingdom opposed to George Washington was anything but that, a lot of internal division.
So here we are sitting in the year 2025, almost 2026, or literally 250 years after the revolution started. How can we look around the world today and see the impacts of the revolution itself?
Yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about. Um, the first thing to say is that the American Revolution succeeds. The Patriots successfully break away from a very powerful empire by drawing in other powers and other help to do so. That sets an unprecedented example. They're the first group of insurgents in more than 200 years to achieve that sort of outcome. And therefore, when other insurgents with other grievances in other empires in other places look around for example and precedent and inspiration, they often turn to the American Revolution. And they often turn specifically to the idea of declaring their independence through a written document, something Thomas Jefferson famously did in 1776. And so, as the Harvard historian David Armitage has shown in a book about the global ripple effects of the Declaration, insurgents everywhere start writing their own declarations of independence as part of their toolbox of weapons to separate out from their own imperial overlords. So in the Haitian Revolution, there's a Haitian Declaration of Independence modeled on the American one. In all the South American revolutions of the 1810s and 1820s, in the age of Bolivar, they're all writing declarations of independence. Some of them quote the American one word for word, others borrow similar language and paraphrase. So we could say, as David Armitage does, that The American Declaration inaugurates the genre of declaration writing as a tool of insurgency. And if we look around the world today, Evan, there's about 200 countries in the world. More than 100 of them have authored declarations of independence at some point as they were decolonizing themselves from other empires. So we have the American Declaration to thank as a sort of blueprint for how to go from a world of empires to a world of states. There's no bigger significance for the American Revolution than that.
What about the way countries are allied with each other? There are all these agencies of countries. You have NATO, and you have the European Union, and then you have the people who are clearly friends and the people who are clearly foes. What did the revolution do to sort of begin to shape these global alliances, or is that something that's always been sort of going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely complicated. Let's be clear about that. But I think there is a lesson there, right? We're right now in a phase of American history in which we hear the phrase America first and America alone. I don't think that's the lesson of the American Revolution. I think the lesson of patriot strategy in the American Revolution is America among, is America building alliances with other groups and other states with common interests, creating coalitions of the willing to amplify their power in service of common goals. So the multinationalism, the alliance building, the consensus building that we find from the senior ranks of the Continental Congress and Continental Army to the courts of Europe and even as far as India, I think is a really important sort of lingering lesson of the American Revolution. It's a reminder that the American Revolution was not separate from world history. It was a major event within world history. And that is how America built its achievement by reaching out to the world, not shying away from it.
What advice do you have for Americans who want to learn more about what the world thinks of their country?
Oh, geez. Um, I I find whenever I go abroad in the last few years and people hear actually the American tinges to my accent that you may not be able to hear, Evan, and they say, "Oh, he's an American," and I and I feel a bit awkward about
Are you
saying,
sure?
what, it's
Yeah.
very
How do you know? Yeah.
complicated. I would say that many people around the world assume that all Americans vote the same way, that all of us are equally responsible for U.S. foreign policy, for instance, or U.S. domestic policy on any given day. And that can be a very humbling experience for me because I'm often at odds with American foreign policy and domestic policy in the current in environment. So it might be a reminder for us when we think about people in other countries to remember there's going to be internal division and disagreement and tumult within those countries, and we shouldn't paint with too broad a brush when we're thinking about people elsewhere around the world. But I also think that America retains a unique position in the world even today. And there are plenty of people out there around the world rooting for our better angels to assert themselves at this moment.
You may have heard of Ken Burns. You may have heard that he produced a documentary that is now airing on PBS stations all over the country and I think on Amazon about the American Revolution. I don't know if you saw it, but
I
I
did.
guess
I did.
you did. So you've
Yeah.
seen it. Did that documentary properly place the American Revolution in the context of the world the way that your book does?
Evan, it did not. People should go buy the book. But let's
Perfect.
be clear. Let's be clear. Ken Burns is a great American. I'm really glad he is our most prominent documentarian. He did 12 hours on the American Revolution and made some nods in the direction of the global ripple effects and global significance of this war. He name checks France a couple of times. I don't think that's sufficient. I think there's more to it, but I also certainly appreciate what Ken did accomplish in the war, in the documentary, excuse me, which is remind us that indigenous people are central actors in the war, that remind us that African descended people are central actors in the war, and that the American Revolution is many things, one of which is a civil war among Americans, neighbor versus neighbor. Those are all significant achievements, and he deserves credit for that.
How is life as a college professor these days?
I teach at the University of Maryland, a state school just outside Washington, D.C. I would say my own pedagogical life hasn't changed much. I'm used to talking about difficult, sensitive topics with smart and curious students and being careful about what I say because I strive for accuracy all the time. So nothing much has changed for me at this point. But I'm certainly in great sympathy with colleagues in other parts of the country who've seen elected officials wade into curriculum battles to the point of effectively censoring what professional historians and other educators are allowed to say in college classrooms. I think that's a very worrisome development. I do think that academic university education should be left to the professionals who do this, not necessarily put in the hands of our sort of political grinder that we have today. So this is a hinge point in the history of American education. Do we believe in academic freedom? Do we believe in free speech and critical thinking and hearing diverse viewpoints, all of which happen in college classrooms right here, right now? Or do we want to lurch into a very different direction?
So you've got this book here. It's certainly made a splash. I'm curious, in 50 years or 100 years, what you hope historians will be using your book for.
Yeah, I mean, I hope my global history of the American Revolution will expand the conversation because professional historians have been talking in global terms about American history for some time, but I would argue that it's not broken through into the public conversation about the American Revolution. My book tries to bridge that gap between how historians talk to each other about the revolution and how the public talks about the American Revolution in global terms. So we've seen, I think, a gradual sort of widening of our context in the last 50 years. Historians started to talk about the Atlantic world 50 years ago, putting North America in its Atlantic context. 20 years ago, we started putting America in its continental context, looking west, for instance. I would argue right now we're riding a wave of global history, which is what my book tries to do. So notice how we're getting wider and wider and wider. Where do we go next after the global turn? Do we go to space? I don't know. Space and the American Revolution? I don't know. I guess we'll see where we are in 50 years.
So you and I have an interesting connection. That is that a fellow reporter here in Tampa, a sports reporter named Kevin Lewis, is married to your sister. How is Kevin doing? And do you follow his exploits here in Tampa Bay?
Yeah, I'll just correct the record here. My wife's brother is Kevin Lewis
Oh, I'm
there.
sorry.
Yeah,
What did I
no worries.
say?
No worries.
So your
So
wife's brother. Okay, got it.
yeah,
Sorry.
my
Okay.
wife's brother. Yeah, my wife's from Missouri, and so Kevin's originally from Missouri. He's a sports reporter for one of the great Tampa stations. He's had a lot to cover in recent years because Tampa
Yeah.
sports teams have had quite the run. I understand. Now, I can't sustain a conversation with my brother about my brother-in-law about American sports because I'm British and I do not care about American about American
Yeah.
sports, but I do care a lot about American history. So he's been down in the Tampa area for a few years, making a name for himself. I've seen my brother-in-law's face on buses in Tampa.
I've
Maybe it
seen it
happened
too.
to you,
Yeah.
Evan, too.
I've seen it too.
And that's a wild experience to see someone you know's face on the side of a bus. And so
The,
I look forward to going down to the Tampa area every few months. The weather is so much better in your neck of the woods than where I live in Washington. We're recording this in December, where it's freezing
it's
outside in
nice here,
Washington,
baby.
D.C. And I'm going down to Tampa in a couple of days.
It's nice here. So your book, the copy of the book that I have, does not have the dedication in it. So I'm wondering, who is this book dedicated to and why?
Yeah, so I've written a few books. So one book was dedicated to my wife, Kevin's sister. Another book was dedicated to my parents. My last book, Stolen, was dedicated to our children, Ruby and Rosie. This new one is dedicated to three teachers who changed my life. One at the high school level, who got me away from memorizing names and dates and made me see that history is about understanding people and empathy. His name was David Hopper. It's also dedicated to my greatest college undergraduate professor who turned me on to American history. Her name was Betty Wood. And then to my PhD advisor at Harvard, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who steered me towards what I do for a living now. So it's dedicated to David, Betty, and Laurel, my teachers.
Awesome. Do you have a project that is in the works already, or are you going to noodle around for a little bit?
I'm definitely not noodling. I'm working on all cylinders right now. So in the spring of 2026, I'll be having a big video lecture course on the great courses about the Declaration of Independence. So if listeners want to take a deep dive, I think it's 6 hours long, into the history, causes, context, and consequences of the Declaration of Independence, right in time for America 2026 next July, then look for me on the great courses. There'll be a new course about the Declaration of Independence.
Ooh, so fun. We'll be listening. Dr. Richard Bell, the author of The American Revolution and the Fate of the World, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, Em.
Check out the book and also his website, richard-bell.com. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. AxelBankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, our featured episodes, and also a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.